On a warm Saturday morning, my son looked me in the eye and said, "You're not welcome." No explanation, no softening, just those three words, cutting through the quiet like a snapped branch. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him, that maybe he meant something else, something less final. But then he shifted his gaze to the floor, as if the weight of his own words was too much to bear. I had asked him a simple question. What time should I be at the neighborhood gathering tonight? I'd been to every one of those for the past 20 years, back when the barbecue smoke curled up from my own grill and children darted between my knees. But this year, I hadn't even known it was happening. Not until Mrs. Fletcher mentioned it while watering her roses, her voice casual but her eyes flicking toward me with a trace of pity. It was the way he said it. Not loud, not angry, just flat, as if my presence was an inconvenience, a burden he'd rather not explain to the others. As if somehow the man who had built the fence around that very yard, who had poured concrete for the driveway in the summer heat, no longer belonged on the other side of it. The words clung to me like frost, seeping into my chest until every breath felt colder. I wanted to ask why, to demand a reason, but the moment stretched too long and he filled it by glancing at his phone, as if the conversation, and I, had already ended. I stepped back from his porch, my hands empty, my head heavier than when I'd walked up. It was strange, the way the street looked the same, the sun spilling across the lawns, children's bicycles leaning against fences, and yet nothing felt familiar anymore. As I turned to leave, I caught a flicker of movement from Mrs. Fletcher's window, her lace curtain falling back into place. She had seen. Maybe others had too. And while my son thought this was just about one evening, I knew it was about something deeper. The kind of cut that doesn't heal with small talk or holiday cards. It was a fracture that would be noticed, even if no one dared to name it yet. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to you every day. Now, let's continue. And in that moment, walking away from his door, I realized the gathering tonight would be louder without me, but not warmer. By the time evening came, the sky was painted in deep orange and fading gold, the kind of light that makes every house look warmer than it really is. I walked the familiar path to my son's place, my steps slow but steady, as if giving him time to reconsider whatever had made him shut me out that morning. The street was alive. The sound of clinking glasses, bursts of laughter spilling from open yards, the faint smell of grilled meat drifting in the air. Every doorway seemed to hum with welcome, every porch light glowed like an invitation, except the one I was walking toward. I reached his front steps and hesitated, my hand hovering near the railing. For a moment, I imagined he would open the door wide, his earlier words replaced by an awkward smile, a muttered apology, maybe even a seat waiting for me at the long table out back. But when the door cracked open, it was only wide enough for his face, no warmth in his eyes, no trace of the boy who used to run into my arms after school, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Just a man who had already decided where I did and did not belong. "You're not welcome," he said again, his voice low, almost as if he was afraid the others inside might hear. He didn't shout, didn't argue, but the firmness in his tone left no room for questions. In the half-second before the door closed, I caught a glimpse past his shoulder, the glint of wine glasses on a counter, a row of coats on the rack, the soft glow of string lights casting shadows on the living room wall. And then, nothing. The click of the latch was softer than a heartbeat, but it might as well have been a slammed gate. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the painted wood, at the brass doorknob that had once turned easily in my hand when Sunday dinners were a tradition. Now it was just another closed surface between us, a line I wasn't meant to cross. Behind the door, voices rose and fell, their laughter carrying faintly through the cracks. It wasn't the sound of cruelty. No one inside knew what had just happened on the porch. To them, I was simply absent. The air felt colder than the season allowed. I turned, my footsteps slow on the porch steps, aware that with everyone I was putting distance not just between myself and the house, but between who we had been and who we had become. The gathering had begun, but so had something else. The quiet, steady unraveling of a bond I had once believed nothing could break. The streetlights had already come on, casting their pale halos onto the pavement, making the air feel both exposed and empty. I stepped off his porch and into that glow, the light catching on my shoulders as if it were marking me for everyone to see. My shadow stretched long and thin across the cracked sidewalk, leading me forward, but never quite catching up. It felt strange, walking away from a place where I had once been part of the center, now reduced to a figure moving quietly along the edge. From behind curtained windows came the sounds of life I was no longer part of. Clinking glasses, the swell of voices telling stories over plates of food, laughter that rose and then fell into murmurs. It wasn't that I wanted the noise, it was that I had always belonged to it. I had helped build it, brick by brick, year by year. The block parties, the barbecues, the shared ladders and borrowed tools. The neighborhood had grown around connections like mine, and now somehow I was walking outside of it, as if a wall had gone up overnight and I'd been left on the wrong side. The wind was light, but carried with it the scent of grilled meat and freshly cut grass, each smell a small reminder of summers gone by, when my son was young and the world between us was uncomplicated. Back then, the streetlights meant something different. They were the call home after playing catch on the lawn, the glow under which we'd carry folding chairs back into the garage after a long evening with friends. Tonight, their light felt like a silent witness to my exile, watching without judgment but without comfort. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed and footsteps hurried toward one of the houses, a late arrival to the gathering I had been turned away from. The door opened wide for them, spilling golden light onto the sidewalk before closing again. It was such a simple act, a welcome, but it carried a weight I could feel in my chest. I kept walking, the hum of the neighborhood fading behind me with each step. My shoes tapped against the concrete in a rhythm that felt deliberate, like the slow toll of a bell. I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what I'd see. A row of lit windows, warm and alive, and somewhere among them, my son's house, bright on the inside, dim from the street, and no place for me. The streetlights followed me in silence, their glow steady and unblinking as if they understood exactly what had just been taken from me. I might have kept walking, kept my eyes fixed on the cracked pavement ahead, if not for a glimmer of movement that caught me from the corner of my vision. Between the slats of a neighbor's fence and the gaps in hedges, I could see the backyard of my son's house lit with strands of warm yellow bulbs, draped like soft halos over the long table. It was the kind of table built for celebration, wood worn smooth from years of dinners, laughter, and the steady passing of bread baskets from hand to hand. Tonight it was dressed in white linen, plates set in neat circles, glasses waiting to be filled. Every seat was taken, bodies leaning in toward each other, except for one. At the far end, just within the glow of the string lights, a single chair sat empty. It wasn't pushed back, wasn't covered with a coat or blocked by serving dishes. It was simply there, a space meant for someone who hadn't arrived. Me. I didn't need to be told. The shape of that absence was one I knew by heart. My son was moving between guests, a polite smile fixed to his face. He refilled glasses, leaned down to listen to snippets of conversation, laughed in the right places. And then, as if by accident, his gaze flicked toward that chair. It was the smallest glance, but it was enough. For a heartbeat, his smile faltered. His eyes seemed to rest there, just long enough for me to wonder what he was thinking. But whatever passed through him, he didn't linger. He turned away, busying himself with a serving tray, speaking to someone who touched his arm. The emptiness of that chair wasn't loud, but it was present. It sat there like a truth no one wanted to name. Guests noticed. I could tell by the way their eyes moved past it quickly, the way conversations shifted when their glances strayed too far in that direction. People pretend not to see what makes them uncomfortable, but absence has a weight, and it pulls at everything around it. I stayed in the shadows, just far enough to be unseen, close enough to feel the ache of what I was looking at. That chair was more than a seat. It was a history. Years of shared meals, inside jokes, advice offered over coffee, small celebrations that weren't marked on any calendar, but mattered all the same. And now, it was a reminder that even history can be erased from a table in a single night. When I finally turned away, the lights behind me seemed brighter for a moment, as if they were trying to hold my attention, to make me stay. But I knew better. You can't sit at a table where you've been told you don't belong, not even if the chair is still waiting. I turned from that glowing backyard and began the walk home, each step heavy enough to leave an imprint in the gravel and dirt along the sidewalk. I didn't hurry. There was no reason to. The kind of hurt I carried now wasn't the kind you could outrun. My pace was slow, deliberate, the way you move when you want the world to notice, even if you don't turn to see who's watching. The night air had shifted. It wasn't just the scent of grilled food anymore. It carried something sharper, more fragile, the faint sound of murmurs drifting from behind me, the shuffle of chairs, the pause in laughter that spreads like a ripple across still water. At first it was just a feeling, that subtle tightening at the back of your neck when you know eyes have found you. Then I heard it, the low creak of a porch swing coming to a stop, the faint squeal of a screen door opening, the metallic clink of cutlery set down mid-meal. They weren't calling out, not yet. People rarely speak first in moments like this. Instead, they watch. They watch and wait, trying to read in the slope of your shoulders and the weight of your stride what has happened, and whether it matters enough to them to leave the comfort of their seat. I didn't glance back, but the sound around me began to change. A gate latch lifted somewhere to my left. Footsteps, light, cautious, touched the pavement and then fell in behind me, not close enough to walk beside me, but close enough to say without words, "I see you." A dog barked twice, silenced by a soft shushing voice that seemed to fade as I moved forward. From a high porch across the street, I caught the scrape of a chair leg against wood, followed by a voice whispering something I couldn't make out. It felt almost like the tide coming in, small waves of attention, of recognition, rolling toward me in quiet surges. People were leaving their conversations mid-sentence, setting down plates that still held food, pushing back from tables to watch the man who had just been told he didn't belong. Some expressions were puzzled, some were softened with sympathy, others were clouded by something harder to name. Maybe guilt, maybe the unease of recognizing that a line had been crossed, and that they had witnessed it without stopping it. I kept my eyes forward, my steps steady. I didn't need to see their faces to know the truth. Wordless choices were already being made behind me. The sound of my own footsteps no longer traveled alone. It carried the faint echo of others beginning to follow, their movements tentative at first, like the first leaves trembling before a wind picks up, and somewhere inside my son's backyard, the laughter that had filled the air only minutes before had thinned to something brittle, ready to break under the weight of silence. I was halfway down the block when I heard it. My name, spoken with the kind of sharpness that slices through every other sound. It wasn't a question. It wasn't gentle. It was the voice of someone who had just seen enough to understand too much. I slowed, but I didn't turn right away. The air seemed to pause with me, as if the night itself was listening for what would happen next. Mrs. Fletcher stood at the edge of my son's yard, her plate of food abandoned on the table without so much as a napkin over it. She had been there since before my boy was born, a woman with a spine of steel and a heart that could carry the whole street if it had to. I remembered her husband fixing the roof with me one summer, her bringing over pies when my wife was sick, her voice the one to call the kids in when the streetlights came on. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the kind of presence that stitched a community together. She didn't glance at my son as she stepped around him. I caught the way he shifted, as if trying to block her path without making it obvious, but she simply sidestepped him, her eyes fixed on me. There was no hesitation in her pace, no polite nods to the other guests as she passed. Her movements carried the quiet authority of someone who had made up her mind before she even stood from her seat. When she reached me, she didn't start with questions or pity. She didn't ask what happened or why I was walking away. She already knew enough. She simply matched her stride to mine, her presence beside me like a flag planted in the ground for all to see. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, the kind of act that sends ripples through a crowd faster than shouting ever could. Behind us, I could feel the eyes multiplying. I imagined forks suspended in mid-air, wine glasses resting untouched on lips, conversations cut clean in half. My son's voice rose faintly, saying something I couldn't catch, but it carried that brittle edge of someone trying to keep control of a room that was slipping from his hands. Mrs. Fletcher didn't speak right away, and I was grateful for the silence. Her company was enough, a small anchor against the pull of what I'd just left. I thought of all the years we'd sat across from each other at neighborhood tables, her hand waving off my thanks when she brought over soup or watched the house while I traveled. Now she was walking beside me without needing to be asked, without waiting to see who else would follow. It struck me then how rare it is for someone to cross a room in your defense before they even know the full story. And in that moment, with her steps keeping pace with mine, I realized I wasn't walking alone anymore, and that my leaving had just become something much bigger than me. At first, it was only a feeling, that subtle shift in the air when a room's warmth begins to fade, when noise turns thin and brittle without anyone meaning for it to. Mrs. Fletcher and I had barely made it to the corner when the sound behind us changed. The easy hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware on plates, the bursts of laughter that had filled my son's backyard. They began to falter, breaking apart like a melody losing its rhythm. What replaced them was not immediate quiet, but something more fragile, pauses, too many, too long. I imagined heads turning toward the gate, glances exchanged across the table, eyes darting between the empty chair at the end and the sight of us walking away. I pictured forks being set down with the faintest clink, hands curling around glass stems, but not lifting them. Somewhere, a child's voice asked a question, only to be hushed quickly by a parent who didn't have an answer that would fit the moment. Then came the first sound of movement, the scrape of a wooden chair leg against the patio, sharp enough to make others turn their heads. A set of footsteps followed, soft on the grass, hesitant in their pace, as if the person wasn't sure they should be doing what they were about to do. And then another. The gate creaked open and closed once, then again. There was a strange rhythm to it, like dominoes falling in slow motion. One by one, chairs shifted, napkins were folded and left behind, and feet began to move toward the sidewalk. Some steps were quick, almost urgent, as if the decision had been made before the meal even began. Others were reluctant, the weight of social ties pulling at ankles, the discomfort of choosing sides pressing into each step. But still, they came. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sounds told me enough. The chorus of shoes against pavement, the low murmur of voices growing closer, the metallic jingle of a fence latch left to swing shut on its own. Even the air felt different, less confined, as if the night had widened to make space for something bigger than one man's quiet walk home. Beside me, Mrs. Fletcher's pace never changed. She didn't turn to see who was following. She didn't slow to let them catch up. It wasn't about numbers. It was about the choice. The visible, undeniable act of standing with someone who'd been told they didn't belong. Somewhere behind us, I knew my son was still in the backyard, the hum of conversation now reduced to a scatter of voices, none of them enough to fill the space we'd taken with us. The party hadn't ended, but its pulse had changed, and I had the strange, bittersweet sense that the silence trailing us now would be louder in his memory than all the noise he'd tried to keep inside those fences. We didn't speak. There was nothing to explain, nothing to defend. The night itself seemed to understand that words would only dull the truth of what was happening. So we kept walking, Mrs. Fletcher and I at the front, the slow rhythm of our footsteps joined by others falling in behind us. At first the sound was scattered, uneven, like rain beginning to fall. But as more joined, it became steady, almost ceremonial. It wasn't a march, not quite, but it carried the same gravity. The street was lined with familiar houses, each one holding memories, block parties, holiday lights, snow shoveled together after storms. Tonight, Those same houses became silent witnesses, their porch lights spilling pale gold onto the procession moving past. Some faces appeared in windows, framed by the glow of living rooms. Curtains shifted as we passed, and I wondered what they saw. A man at the front, walking without looking back, his neighbors following in quiet solidarity. There were no speeches, no raised voices, no accusations thrown into the air. That was the beauty and the weight of it. The leaving itself was the statement. Every step away from my son's house was a wordless verdict on what had just happened there. People didn't need to name it to feel it. The empty space between the footsteps spoke louder than anything we could have said aloud. I felt the cool night air move differently now, wrapping around us like a tide that had decided to change direction. There was no destination announced, yet everyone seemed to know where we were going. Not just toward my home, but toward a place where the balance of respect had been restored, if only by presence. Some carried their drinks in hand, their plates left behind on the table we'd all seen under the string lights. Others walked with arms folded, their faces unreadable, but their pace unflinching. A few looked almost startled by their own decision to leave, as if they'd been carried forward by something larger than choice, something instinctive. And still, no one said a word. The only sounds were the faint shuffle of feet against pavement, the occasional creak of a porch step, as someone joined us from their own home, the low sigh of wind through the trees. My son's laughter, or what had been his laughter, no longer reached us. It had been swallowed by the distance, replaced by the steady, relentless sound of leaving. In that quiet, I realized this was no longer about me alone. It had started with a door closing in my face, but what followed was a door opening in the hearts of the people who now walked with me. And each step forward felt like something being written into the memory of this street, a story that would be told without words because everyone who mattered had already walked it. I didn't turn back, but I could feel him there, rooted at the gate like a man caught between pride and panic. Later, someone told me exactly what it looked like. My son standing stiff, shoulders squared, as if holding on to the last image of control, his hand curled around the top of the latch until his knuckles whitened. He had been smiling moments earlier, that polished kind of smile you wear when you're hosting, when you're trying to convince yourself and everyone else that all is well. But now it wavered, thin as glass, under the weight of what he was seeing. One by one, the faces that had been gathered around his table, the friends, the neighbors, the people whose laughter had filled his yard, were moving toward the street. They weren't rushing. They weren't making a scene. But they weren't hesitating either. Some gave him brief glances as they passed, a flicker of something in their eyes, apology, disappointment, even quiet reproach, before they shifted their gaze forward and kept walking. Others didn't look at him at all, as if acknowledging him might weaken their resolve. He stayed there, fingers locked on the metal gate, watching the space between himself and the group widen with every step. He must have known that nothing he said in that moment would bring them back. Words wouldn't matter now. The leaving was too clear, too deliberate. I imagine he tried to hold my gaze, even though I never gave him the satisfaction of meeting it. Maybe he thought that if I turned, I'd see the regret forming in his expression, the plea rising behind his eyes. Or maybe it wasn't regret at all. Maybe it was only the shock of realizing that the choice he made, so certain in the moment, had grown far beyond his control. It's a strange thing how quickly the center of gravity can shift. One moment, all attention is gathered in your backyard under the warm glow of string lights. The next, the center moves, out through the gate, down the street, and you're left holding an empty space that no amount of music or food can fill. The procession passed him entirely now, the sounds of footsteps and low murmurs fading into the rhythm of the street. Still, he didn't move. His grip on the gate seemed almost desperate, like if he let go, the last thread between him and the people leaving would snap for good. But the truth was, it already had. All that was left was a man standing in a doorway that no one was coming through, watching the back of the one person he had told was not welcome, and the quiet trail of loyalty that followed him. By the time the last guest slipped past him, the gate hung half open, swaying slightly in the night air. The music still played from the speakers in the backyard. the soft strum of a guitar track looping as if nothing had changed. Platters of food remained on the table, steam curling faintly from dishes that no one would touch now. The string lights still glowed warmly, casting their soft patterns over the white linen, but their light seemed to fall on an entirely different scene than the one that had existed just minutes earlier. The chairs were there, yes, but they were empty. The glassware still shimmered in the lamplight, but it caught no movement, no reaching hands, no laughter bouncing between them. A bowl of salad sat with serving tongs resting on top, as if frozen mid-use. Somewhere a slice of bread had gone cold beside a folded napkin. Everything looked like a party paused, waiting for its people to return. But they wouldn't. He stepped back into the yard, almost cautiously, as though he might disturb the stillness that had settled there. The air felt heavier now, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but accusing. The yard was full of things, food, music, light. Yet it felt stripped bare. What makes a gathering is not the table or the music. It's the presence, the connection. Without that, the glow of the lights only made the emptiness sharper. I imagine him standing there, glass still in his hand, hearing the clink of ice shift in the silence. Perhaps he glanced toward the gate again, hoping for some straggler to return, for someone to peek in and say they'd forgotten something, but no one did. Even the houses nearby seemed to hold themselves apart, their lit windows facing inwards, away from him. It must have been then, with the night closing in, that he realized the truth. You can fill every plate, pour every glass, and still be left alone if you forget the one thing that makes people stay: respect. Once that is gone, no invitation, no display, no music can cover the absence. The air was full of the smell of grilled meat and fresh bread, but it couldn't mask the taste of loss that must have been settling in his mouth. And so he stood, host to a party that had become nothing more than an arrangement of empty chairs and cooling dishes, a stage without an audience. The lights would keep burning for hours yet, but the night, the real night, had already walked out through his gate. Later, word found its way to me. Not through him, of course, but through the quiet channels a neighborhood always keeps alive. People spoke in fragments, in lowered voices, like they were passing along something fragile. They said that after we left, he tried to explain, that he stood in the middle of his own backyard, hands gesturing in that restless way he's had since childhood, insisting it was complicated, that I wouldn't understand, that there were reasons. But those reasons, whatever they were, seemed to dissolve in the air as soon as they left his mouth. No one I spoke to could remember a single one clearly. That's the thing about the truth. When it's real, it plants itself in memory. When it's not, it slides away, leaving only the hollow shape of an excuse. They told me he avoided specifics, that he kept circling around words without letting them land. It wasn't the right time, he'd say. Things have changed. Dad's different now. But every sentence seemed to tighten rather than loosen the knot he'd tied. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the gate we had walked through, their silence answering for them when he paused to see if anyone agreed. In moments like that, you can't talk your way back to dignity. You can only act your way there. But the act he'd chosen, the one that started it all, had been to close a door. And once people see you close it on someone they've known, someone they've shared years with, it becomes harder for them to forget than you'd like. One neighbor told me she kept looking at the empty plates on the table as he spoke, the half-drunk glasses of wine, the way the chairs sat unevenly, some pushed out, some tucked in, as if the people who'd been in them had never quite left willingly. The scene behind him didn't match the story he was trying to tell in front of it. That's the crack where truth slips through, the space between what's said and what's seen. And that night, it spilled out everywhere. No matter how carefully he tried to hold it back, the picture was already painted in the minds of the people who'd been there. A gate left swinging, a quiet procession down the street, and the one person he had turned away at the door, walking home with half the neighborhood at his side. You can't cover that with complicated. You can't wrap it in "you wouldn't understand." People understood more than he wanted them to, and perhaps more than he understood himself. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. When I reached my house, the night had deepened, and the air had that cool edge that makes you want to linger outside just a little longer before retreating indoors. I stepped onto the porch, and almost without thinking, flipped on the light. Its glow spilled over the wooden steps and across the path, a small beacon against the dark. I hadn't intended it as a signal, but it became one. The first to arrive was Mrs. Fletcher, of course. Her pace unhurried but steady, as if she had simply followed the natural pull of the moment. Then came others, couples still holding hands from the walk, a teenager with his jacket slung over his shoulder, a mother balancing a plate she must have taken straight from the abandoned table. They didn't ask where to go or what to do. They just found places. Some sat on the steps, knees drawn up, elbows resting casually as though they had been there 100 evenings before. Others leaned against the porch railing, the wood creaking faintly under their weight. Someone disappeared for a moment and came back with a folding chair from the trunk of their car. Another slipped into my kitchen without asking, reappearing with a tray of teacups and a steaming pot, the scent of chamomile curling into the cool night air. The laughter that returned was not the loud, performative kind you hear over clinking glasses and background music. It was softer, closer to the ground, woven into quiet conversation and the gentle clatter of spoons against porcelain. People spoke in low voices, not out of secrecy but out of comfort, the way you do when you're among those who don't need you to raise your voice to be heard. Children wandered the edges of the yard, their games quieter now, but no less joyful, the beam of the porch light catching in their hair as they darted past. Every so often, someone would lift their head toward me, not with questions, not with pity, but with the kind of acknowledgement that carries its own unspoken promise. We're here. I didn't make a speech. I didn't thank them, though my chest ached with the weight of wanting to. Instead, I poured tea into the first outstretched cup, then the next, moving slowly down the line. It felt almost like passing bread at a table, a quiet ritual of belonging. From where I stood, I could see the faint glow of my son's backyard in the distance, still lit, still arranged for a gathering that no longer was. But here, under my porch light, the night had reshaped itself. It didn't matter that my yard was smaller, that there was no linen-draped table, no carefully arranged platters. What we had now was different. It was lighter, warmer, and in that moment I understood something I hadn't when I first walked away. Sometimes you lose a place at one table only to find you've been given the head of another. It was late when the knock came, so late that the night had settled into that deep, unbroken quiet where even the crickets seemed to rest. Most of the neighbors had drifted home by then, leaving behind the faint scent of tea and the soft indentations of chairs in my grass. The porch light still burned, casting a pool of warm gold over the steps, but inside, the house had gone still. I was gathering cups from the railing when I heard it. 3 slow knocks, spaced apart, hesitant enough to almost be mistaken for the wind. When I opened the door, he was there. My son. Hands buried deep in his pockets like a boy bracing against a cold wind, though the air was still. He didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he looked just past me, as if staring into the hallway might make this easier. His posture was unfamiliar, shoulders slightly hunched, weight shifting from one foot to the other, like he wasn't sure he was welcome on the threshold. "I didn't think it mattered," he said at last, and the words fell between us with the fragility of something that might break if either of us stepped too close. His voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the confidence he had worn earlier in the day like a well-tailored coat. For a long moment I didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because the silence felt truer than any words I could give him just yet. I watched him, the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of regret in the corners of his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed, the sound carrying easily in the stillness. He took a shallow breath, as if trying to summon the rest of a sentence but finding nothing worth adding. I wondered if he had walked straight from his empty backyard to my door, or if he'd spent hours pacing, building up the courage to face what he had done. Either way, he had arrived with no defense prepared, only the brittle offering of an excuse that was already fraying in the air between us. The porch light cast a line across his face, illuminating one side while the other remained in shadow. And in that half-light, I saw him as both the man he was now and the boy I used to carry on my shoulders, the one who trusted that my presence meant safety, that my being there was never something to question. Tonight, that trust had been broken, and the knock on my door was not enough to fix it. But it was perhaps the beginning of him realizing it needed fixing at all. I didn't step aside to let him in. Not yet. Some doors, once closed, take time to open again, and some truths, once spoken, or left unsaid, take even longer to be heard. I let the silence hold him for a moment longer. The space between us weighted with everything that hadn't been said that night. Then I spoke, my voice steady but quieter than I expected. "It matters," I told him. His eyes flicked to mine, startled by the certainty in my tone. "Not because of the party, but because of what you told me, and what it told them about you." The words landed, and I saw it. That subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth, the way his gaze faltered, as if he wanted to look anywhere but at me. It was the kind of flinch you can't disguise, the involuntary recoil when truth presses too close to the skin. I could have stopped there, but the moment was too raw to leave half-spoken. "You thought it was just between us," I went on, my voice low, almost conversational. "But every choice we make in front of others writes a line in the story they tell about us. Tonight they saw you close a door, and that will stay with them longer than any food you served, any music you played." He shifted his weight, his hands leaving his pockets only to curl slightly at his sides, like he was holding on to words he couldn't quite shape. I didn't rush him. Regret needs room to breathe if it's ever going to grow into something stronger. "When you tell someone they're not welcome," I said, "you're not just telling them where they can't go. You're showing everyone else the limits of your loyalty, your kindness, your respect. And that's what they walked away from tonight. Not me. You." His breath caught, just enough for me to hear it in the quiet. I could see the flicker of defense in his eyes, the instinct to argue, to explain, to salvage the edges of pride. But it faded before it could form. The truth is a heavy thing when you have to hold it alone. For a moment, neither of us moved. The porch light hummed softly above us, casting shadows that shifted with the night breeze. I thought of the long table in his backyard, the empty chair, the way he had gripped the gate as people passed him without a word. That image would stay with me for a long time, but I knew it would stay with him longer. Finally he nodded. Not in agreement, not in surrender, but in that small, reluctant way a person does when they realize the conversation isn't about winning. It's about seeing. And perhaps for the first time that night, he was beginning to. The next week, the street felt different. Not in the way that storms leave debris scattered or winds strip leaves from trees, but in that quiet, unshakable way a place feels when it has seen something it won't forget. People greeted each other a little softer, held conversations a little longer, as though still carrying the echo of what had happened. No one mentioned it outright, not at the mailbox, not over garden fences, but the memory lingered in every glance, in the pauses between words. When the night of the next neighborhood gathering came, I didn't expect anything. I hadn't been invited to host. There had been no meeting, no plan. But as the evening light bled into gold, I stepped outside to find Mrs. Fletcher on my porch again, holding a covered dish. "Figured you'd need this," she said simply, and moved past me toward the kitchen. Then another neighbor arrived with a stack of mismatched plates, then a couple carrying folding chairs, then the Harris boys dragging a cooler that rattled with bottles and ice. It was never announced, but it was understood. The gathering was here now. People took seats on my steps, along the railing, in the patch of grass that had seen so many small moments over the years. The air was filled with that same easy hum as before, but it carried a different weight. not the weight of obligation or habit, but of choice. They had chosen this place, chosen to be here, chosen to stand where they had stood a week earlier when the walk began. And then, quietly, without fanfare, my son came. No grand entrance, no speech in hand. He just walked up the path, a dish of something warm balanced awkwardly in his hands, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found me. He didn't sit far away, not next to me, but close enough that the space between us felt intentional, not accidental. Close enough that I could feel the start of something, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the slow rebuilding of a bridge he had burned without realizing how much light it had once carried. The night unfolded without speeches, without anyone naming why we were all here instead of somewhere else. But it didn't need to be said, because once a street has walked out with you, it never forgets why it did. And as the laughter rose again under my porch light, softer but warmer than before, I knew this wasn't just a gathering. It was a reminder that respect, once shown in the quiet solidarity of footsteps, can become the kind of memory a place will carry for as long as it stands.